Thank you so much for coming this early in the morning to spend time with me here. I'm here among a group of people that I feel so much connection with. As many of you know, I work as a sex researcher at Indiana University, but also have an enormous amount of passion for sex education. So this is a group that I feel at home in. I want to start by acknowledging the members of our team, Michael Reese, Dennis Fortenberry, Stephanie Sanders, Vanessa Schick, Brian Dodge, and most especially our PhD students, who you see several of whom are pictured here, who really work side by side, me and the rest of our team, in doing the research and in finding kind of interesting and innovative ways of sharing it with people so that we can all learn from it. I also want to thank Church & Dwight, who have the Trojan brand. You all know Trojan condoms and lubricants and vibrators. And they really have supported these studies of sexual behavior in the United States, the National Surveys of Sexual Health and Behavior. And they have been such an important partner in understanding what sex looks like in contemporary society. You may remember that until the 2009 NSSHB, we hadn't had a nationally representative survey of sex in America since the early 1990s, which was before the internet. So that's really how outdated so much of our information about sex in America was. And so it's really thanks to them that we have changed that landscape. And of course, I want to thank the many thousands of women and men who participated in our studies, people as young as 14 and as old as their mid-90s, who decided to trust us and to share in our anonymous surveys what their lives were really like, everything about love and marriage and relationships and vaginal intercourse and anal intercourse and engagement in oral sex and desire and pleasure, all kinds of things. I mean, they answered so many questions, and it's because of the fact that they took the time to do that and trusted that we were sincere in our efforts that, again, we have the data that we do. I also want to thank Bill Taverner for having me here today. And really for supporting me since the beginning. He was somebody who, when I first started going to research and education conferences, was nice enough to come and talk to me when I was a brand new graduate student and to support me in my desires to further my education and become a sex educator and researcher. And those early mentors that you have and role models really stick with you. And also my mom, who made the trip to come out here. So. Thank you. This is the first time that she's come to a sexuality education conference. So she's meeting a lot of interesting people. And I think this morning at breakfast told me that she feels like she may have something to offer those around her in this field, because she already talks to people in her neighborhood and so on. So she may just be another sex educator in the future. You never know. So, although most of my research day-to-day is most of my work day-to-day is in sexuality research, I feel so passionate that this research only matters to the extent that we're able to share it with other people. And I had been doing this work for quite some time and writing columns and books and doing things like that for quite some time before I had ever stumbled upon this wonderful quote from Alfred Kinsey that he and his team wrote in the 1953 volume Sexual Behavior in the Human Female, where he wrote, "We believe that the scientist who obtains his right to investigate from the citizens at large is under obligation to make his findings available to all who can utilize his data. The scientist who investigates sexual behavior seems under a special obligation to make his findings available to the maximum number of persons, for there are few aspects of human biology with which more persons are more often concerned." And as a result, they didn't bury their research away in obscure journals that only, a few hundred people might have read. Instead, they shared their findings widely in the Sexual Behavior in the Human Male, Sexual Behavior in the Human Female, two books that came to be known popularly as the Kinsey Reports. And so it's really thanks to them that millions of Americans learned that actually they weren't so unusual, they weren't alone, and that many people had similar questions and similar experiences in their lives. We also know our wonderful former Surgeon General, Dr. Joycelyn Elders, really was an advocate for sexuality education and for us learning at young ages onward the truth about our bodies and our experiences as human beings. As she said, we've tried ignorance for a very long time, and it's time we try education. Education is so important around sexual health and around our bodies. It's also important that it be evidence-based. We're always pushing, as a field, right, for evidence-based sexuality education. That evidence comes from research. That doesn't mean everyone needs to become a researcher, but our fields need to work really closely together so that the kinds of information that researchers produce can be shared widely by the people who are really good at reaching communities all over the world, people like you. So just a broad overview here about the studies where a lot of these data come from. The National Surveys of Sexual Health and Behavior. As I mentioned earlier, we did our first one in 2009. This was a survey of about 6,000 Americans ages 14 to 94. We've had about a dozen papers come out of this study already. The 2012 follow-up, and it was around then that we actually were fortunate enough to get support from Church and Dwight to start doing these annually. And so we're gearing up for yet another data collection again in a few months in 2015. Each year they look a little bit different. There's some core items that stay the same where we're tracking behavior across time. We all, many of you remember and many of you have heard about the challenges in the 1980s when we hadn't really ever tracked sexual behavior over time, and suddenly as a society we were shocked by the HIV epidemic. And people started to say, maybe we really need to understand what people are doing sexually and, you know, in this case, how a virus could be spread throughout communities in what ways. And so now we're tracking not only sexual behaviors, but from year to year, different interest areas. So some years this may be, you know, the use of sexual enhancement products, the use of lubricants. Sometimes it's about love and intimacy and relationships. It really varies year to year. Here are some of the things that I think have been most illuminating from these studies and what I hope to share with you. The first is that we have sex for an enormous number of reasons, and I think that these reasons show our humanity. We often hear people talk about teenagers as having sex for all the wrong reasons, but of course many of them are having sex for very human reasons that aren't that different than the reasons that non-teenagers have sex. There was a 2007 study out of the University of Texas at Austin that was called Why Humans Have Sex. And they came up with more than 200 reasons that humans have sex that were generated from their study participants. And the top 5 were attraction, physical pleasure, because it feels good, it's fun by men, and to show affection by women. Now, these were important, but if you read the paper, it turns out that these were really, this was a study of college students. So it wasn't quite humans across the lifespan, it was college students. So can I just maybe show your hands, raise your hands, if you, when you educate, if you work with people older than college students? So quite a lot of you. So you know that these are not, you know, not only are they not the only, they're also not the primary reasons that people have sex. So in 2009, when we asked people about their recent sexual behavior, we also asked them, you know, during this instance, why did you have sex? And we also found hundreds of reasons that people have sex, and among them were certainly because it feels good and pleasure and attraction and fun and affection. But we also found that a bunch of other things, that when you got out of the sort of 18 to 24-year-old age group, you also saw a number of people who said, well, because the kids were at a sleepover. Or, it was my birthday. It was our anniversary. We did the study in March, and so many of them, the reason was Valentine's Day. So, you know, we often think about teenagers as seizing this opportunity when their parents go out of town or someone's parents go out of town and they can go to a party. But it's not just in adolescence that you seize opportunity. People were seizing opportunities of also like the baby napping for a little while in order to have sex, and that was the reason that they were able to find time to have sex. Very young people were more often to say that they had sex for fun, for pleasure. But once we got into the mid to late 20s and certainly through the 30s, we saw this, that people talked a lot about love, a lot about intimacy, a lot about connection. They also started talking about mutual desire. You know, we really wanted to be with each other. There were some gender differences that we noticed. We saw many women who talked about duty or obligation, saying things like, well, because I'm his wife, because we're married and that's what you do when you're married, because, you know, I have to, or he's going to nag at me. We didn't see as much of that from men. We saw very little of that from men. What we did see from many men, though, was that many men talked about their own desire, about having sex with somebody because their partner was just so hot, their partner was so attractive. And women didn't say that as often. They talked about it in terms of mutual attraction, like we're really attracted to each other. And I don't think that means that women don't experience that, internal feeling of desire. But I do think, as Deb Tolman, those of you who know her work would really talk about, we often don't give young women the language to talk about their own desire. And for those of you interested in the topic of desire and women's sexuality, I highly recommend this spring picking up a copy, by the way, of Emily Nagoski's new book, Come As You Are. She's here in the audience, and a great sex educator who knows so much about women's sexuality and desire. There are also opportunities of having sex to give things, because people felt bad, because somebody had just been diagnosed with something serious, somebody had lost somebody that they loved. So sex is really kind of like this bonding, reassuring, connecting experience. And then there were people who had sex to get things like attention, revenge, or in one instance, the chance to go out and play bingo. If they just first had sex. So it's a fascinating thing, but I think we have to remember as sexuality educators how rich and nuanced and complex people's lives are. Number 2, love and dating, particularly among young people, may be endangered, but they're not extinct. And this, some of these data that I'm about to show you come from our most recent data collection, but they go a little bit further than that, which is from the human sexuality classes that I teach at IU. So I had gone through this period where I was really getting a little tired of seeing so much of a narrative in the media about hookup culture. Hooking up is nothing new. We've all been doing it for a long time. When I was growing up, people talked about hooking up, and then like 10 years later, a researcher discovered that young people were talking about it, and it became the new thing. It's not a new thing. I once was in a car ride with this iconic feminist who I met at Indiana University when she came and gave a talk, and we were talking about it. She said, people have been having sex with their friends forever. Friends with benefits isn't new. It's not new. But what I think the real challenge is here, it's not that people don't hook up, but I don't think it's everything. I don't think it's all young people are doing. And I find with my students that the vast majority of them write in their papers about really wanting boyfriends or girlfriends, about really wanting to go on dates. I had a girl say to me a couple weeks ago in a talk I was giving for student athletes, she said, just once I want to go on a legitimate date. Girls don't usually believe me when I do sort of like, segregated sex talks, as I'm often asked to do in sororities, fraternities, athletic teams, and so on. Girls often don't believe me that boys want to go on dates. The boys don't believe me that girls want to go on dates. And so I started talking about this in class and started doing class surveys, and in our recent survey, we included just a few items to understand what young people feel about these things. So we asked them to agree, strongly agree, disagree, strongly disagree with statements like, people my age just want to hook up or have casual sex. Turns out that most young people, adolescents, and about half of college-age students, 18 to 24, think that's true. But it gets less and less with age. But it turns out most people want to date. Not surprising for some of us. More than 80% of women and men between the ages of 14 and 24 say they'd rather date someone that they like or love than just hook up with someone casually. In terms of the statement, I hope that sometime in the next year I'm in love with someone who loves me back. About 2/3 of 14 to 17-year-olds feel that way, about 3/4 of 18 to 24-year-olds, and even more of 25 to 34-year-olds. However, about 1/4 of young men and about 1/3 of young women feel that even if they were with somebody who they really liked and wanted to be exclusive with, that saying so would make them look clingy or needy. So my experience as a sex educator is what a lot of young people need. We talk about, permission giving, the implicit model and so on, is they need some permission to date. They need some permission to actually like each other and to feel like they can connect, and that hooking up isn't the only thing that you can do. It's certainly one, but that dating and intimacy is also okay. So I think we need a more human perspective on sexuality education. We've had some successes, we have a long way to go, but some successes in terms of educating about STIs and pregnancy prevention and condom use and birth control, all kinds of things. And we're getting better at that, some states more so than others. But we also need to keep talking about love and intimacy and dating so that people who want to explore those possibilities in their lives can as well. As we'll see throughout the rest of the talk, love and intimacy matter quite a lot. And they matter in terms of health issues too. So, love, there's a lot of research that shows, including ours, that love is related to condom use. So when people feel that they're mutually in love, they love their partner loves them, sometimes they're less likely to use condoms. Now, love is not protection from infections or pregnancy. So while I think many of us can understand that progression, we also want to help keep people safe for as long as we can, right? So we need to promote condom use, but put it within context of relationships as well, and not just something that you do until you're in a relationship or until you're with somebody you love. We really have to continue that conversation. We also see relationships between love and orgasm. Years ago, I had somebody, a woman actually at a hair salon when she found out what I did. She sort of whispered to me and she said, so, it seems like I have orgasms more often with people I love, do you think that's true? There had really been no research on that. It turns out both men and women are 2 times more likely to have an orgasm if they're with somebody who they love and the person loves them back. Another interesting fact I'll let you know, in a couple of our studies now, we find out that 96% of people have sex with people who they match with on love, meaning that the vast majority of people choose to have sex with people who they love and who they feel loves them back. The next biggest bucket is people who they do not love, and they're pretty sure this person does not love them back. Only 4% of people have a mismatch situation, where they love the person and they're pretty sure this person doesn't love them back, or they don't love the person but they think the person loves them. Those are difficult emotional situations to be in, and it turns out most people don't choose them. How we feel about sex is influenced by our age and life events. A big event for many women in particular is pain during intercourse, and so we have a paper in press at the Journal of Sexual Medicine that should be out any day now, showing that this is actually a continuation of earlier data that's already out, showing about 30% of women have pain during vaginal intercourse. But we extended this in the more recent paper to also show that about 70% of women report pain during their most recent anal intercourse event. Most of this is not sort of the wanted, desired type of pain. For the most part, these are experiences of pain that people are not happy with or trying to alleviate in some way, but don't often talk about with a partner. Some men also experience pain during sex, about 7% of men during vaginal sex, about 15% of men during anal sex. And it turns out that when men experience pain, they're even less likely than women to let their partner know. So most men are really just kind of sucking up that pain and not telling their partner that that's what's happening with them. One of the things I've become really interested in, and this is just an early look at it, this will change with time, we're doing sort of looking through these data right now, but is a developmental trajectory of sexual satisfaction and dissatisfaction. And I know these words are really small to read from where you're at, but I'll just give you kind of a brief overview, which is that at different stages of life, different things matter to your sexual satisfaction or dissatisfaction. Men, for example, are more likely to be dissatisfied at the very young ages and much older ages because of performance issues, because of erectile difficulties or premature ejaculation. And it's only really in the 30s, 40s, and 50s that intimacy becomes really, a very persistent issue for them that either enhances satisfaction or if men don't have it, detracts from it. But for men, we have a lot of concerns about having no sex at all. See no sex pop up a lot in 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and older, as well as infrequent sex. And many women say that infrequent sex contributes to their dissatisfaction as well. But that what enhances their satisfaction are things like togetherness, romance, tenderness, feeling wanted. And we kept hearing things like, if we got along better. It was really relational in that sense. Also, at any age, we may be experiencing something about sex for the very first time. I don't have to tell you all this. As sex educators, you're on the ground and you know this. There are always people coming up to you to talk with you about something that is new to them in their lives. And it's not just 16-year-olds having sex for the first time. It's people who are 45 years old and having sex for the first time after a hysterectomy. People who are having sex for the first time after having a baby or during pregnancy, or after surgery for prostate cancer, and so on. To take a much more limited view of this, and again, I know you can't see any of this, but this is a chart to show you the age at first, all kinds of things. Age at first vaginal intercourse, age at first anal intercourse, age at first use of a condom, age at first use of a vibrator. The take-home message for this is really just what we were just talking about, that things happen for the first time at any stage of life. The very top bar is 18%. So you can see nothing ever reaches 18%. In other words, you never even have 18% of people, which is less than 1/5, who are doing something like vaginal intercourse or condom use, or let's take sex after pregnancy or something, for the first time at any age of life, which means that we really need sexuality education across the lifespan. Not just when you're a teenager, not just if you're lucky enough to be in college, across the lifespan. We need our doctors and our nurses to be better equipped to be talking about sexuality with their patients. We need people to be able to access sex educators and sex therapists. We need sex educators working in schools, working in clinics, working in community spaces, and certainly some of you are really active in creating those community spaces so that people can find you in the first place. We know that product use, like use of condoms and vibrators and lubricants, happens across the lifespan. These are not things that happen when you're just very young. You've all seen the data. This is from 2009. This is published by now, data about condom use. That's really high among adolescents, but look at that drop-off among 18 to 24-year-olds. Look at the drop-off. And if you're like, well, that's just because people are in relationships, so they're not at STI risk anymore. No, no, no. As we've published in 2010 in the Journal of Sexual Medicine, it turns out even with casual partners who people do not know well, we had most adolescents who are using a condom with a casual partner, but it really dropped off just by enormous amount just a little bit later in life, just a few years later. And the numbers for older adults are even lower. So we need to keep reminding people about the value of protecting yourself. And one of the things that we heard a little bit yesterday from Jane Fonda when she talked, because we all just hang out with Jane Fonda and it's just the way it goes. But she was talking about dual use, right? So that even when people are using an effective hormonal method, also pairing it with a condom. And I think this is so important because I've been teaching human sexuality now for 11 years at Indiana University. And something really scary happened last year when I was teaching classes, which is that at the end of the semester, I had quite a few students in their end of semester papers where they sort of talk about what did you learn in class and what was good and what could I do better and so on. Quite a few students who talked about how the most important thing that they learned was that condoms protect against sexually transmitted infections. Now, this was like a blip in a day about, different types of contraceptive options. And I thought, how is this like the most striking moment for so many students? And I've been seeing that lately. I didn't used to see that as being such a revelation in college students. So something has changed about the way we're talking about condoms and birth control and STIs at the national level. That shouldn't be shocking information to educated 18, 20, 23-year-olds, but it is. Now, condoms remain our only device to protect against STIs. We all know that the pill doesn't do that. The pill is wonderful about protecting pregnancies, but we still have to work on STI reduction as well, so that shouldn't be shockingly new information. We also need to help young people talk with their families about sexuality and condoms and birth control. We've asked young people if they feel comfortable talking with their parents about these issues when they have questions. Most young people do, but that number drops by half for the 18 to 25-year-olds. So when I talk with my college students about this and we say, what sense do you make of this? I'm sure you guys would probably come to the same conclusion, that for many 14 to 17-year-olds, this feels a little hypothetical. And then at some point, it gets real. And you're like, well, if I ask this, as some of my students were saying the other day, now if I were to ask these questions, my parents would just assume I'm having sex. But if I was asking this question about birth control, let's say, when I was 14 or 15, they might just think that I wanted information. So this becomes a different kind of conversation and not one that families are always that well equipped to have. So particularly for those who are working with families, with parents and their kids, you are absolutely doing amazing work because we need more families to talk amongst themselves as well. I've been really struck recently by how our sexual menu, if you will, narrows with time. And what these slides here, these bright blue columns are really just showing the percentage of people who engaged at the most recent time that they had sex, and by sex we mean things very broadly. But we sort of say, what did you do? Did you have vaginal sex? Did you have anal sex, oral sex? Did you kiss a lot? Did you have breast touching and so on? Did you cuddle? It turns out that lots of people have vaginal sex throughout the lifespan. We see, of course, some decreases with age, but it's still a very common behavior. Oral sex in the green and in the purple are also pretty common, and they stay actually pretty frequent in people's 30s and 40s. Anal sex is never particularly prevalent. There's a lot of people who have tried it once or twice, or some amount of people who do it once or twice a year, but it doesn't tend to be a very frequent behavior in the United States, although for some people it is. And these are the same data for men, so they really kind of mirror each other. But to me, what some of the striking things are how we really see drop-offs in non-intercourse behaviors. We see drop-offs in things like kissing and cuddling and massage and breast stimulation. So that very young people, 18 to 29, are doing all kinds of kissing. Like 90% of them, when they have sex, they kiss. But when we get into the 60s, about a quarter of people aren't kissing when they have sex. That type of intimacy is no longer there. In their 60s, about 40% of people are no longer cuddling in connection with sex, even though at younger ages, about 76% of them were. So we really see kind of the overall landscape of sex changing. Which brings us to ask, what makes for good sex? Love matters, as we've seen, but intimacy wins most of the time. And you can have an intimate experience whether or not you love somebody, whether or not you know them that well, although that tends to be easier when you know them pretty well. Emotional intimacy during sex turns out to be one of the stronger predictors of sexual pleasure and orgasm. We've asked people what makes, thinking back over your whole life, what makes for some of the most enjoyable sex that you've had? People tend to say things like not feeling stressed or hurried or anxious. Women in particular tend to say sex that doesn't hurt, no pain. A lot of people, women and men, but especially women, tend to say more time alone as a couple, just spending time together. And especially beginning in the late 20s and 30s, we see a lot of people talking about what I call mutuality. And so the sense of, we both want to be together, we both desire each other, we're in love with each other, we feel, sex is satisfying for the two of us. It's really about us both. At younger ages, it's much more I. And those of you who are interested in development, you understand that, right? But we have to really move people, I think, earlier from a sense of I to a sense of we. So when we think about many of the gray areas of sexual assault where people can walk away and have very different interpretations of what just happened, a lot of that is also an experience of I, right? Or a sense of, well, I get to have this, or this person, made it look like they wanted to have sex or teased me or was drunk, but I wanted to do this anyway. We need to move away from I and toward we. And now part of that is developmental, and it just unfolds over time. But I think there are a lot of opportunities for us as sexuality educators to really remind people that if there are two people in the room, there are two people in the room. If there are three people in the room, there are three people in the room. But that this is a sense of mutuality. I also never realized, some of you have heard me say this before, I never realized until some of these data came back how important the letter C was to good sex. But you can just see it over and over again. And this is just a sampling of the words again, what makes for your most enjoyable sex. People talk about connection, closeness, cuddling, caressing, communication, comfort, and caring. And many men talk about these things too. This is not just women. Sometimes, especially young people, need reminders that this is not just women. My college students still struggle with this idea. They'll say, well, guys don't like that kind of thing. I say, yes, many men actually really like to cuddle. Many men need to hear from you what you like too. So much of what we can do at early ages too is remind people that the research shows that men and women are far more similar than they are different. Far more similar than different. For those of you who want to look more into that, Janet Hyde's work is just excellent on a range of issues related to sex, but also even to things like academic achievement and so on. So here also I want to give you some of the words from people in our study so that you can hear from them what they find to be among the more enjoyable aspects of their sexual lives from some of the women. And these images, by the way, are from the Kinsey Institute's art collection, so thank you to them for that. It's a silly answer, but I honestly believe that having trust and love is what makes sex enjoyable between partners. I think our charge as sex educators is to get people to still say that, but without it's a silly answer. That's not silly. Time with no kids. Not painful. My boyfriend is the kindest man I've ever met in my entire life. He just makes me so happy. That I'm treated with love and respect during times other than having sex. Willingness of my partner to try different things. Having toys available when having sex with girls is a huge benefit. I only wish I could have a strap on. When I'm with a guy, having him in control and pulling my hair is a huge turn on. And again, as sex educators, also reminding people that women do have a lot of desires too. Sometimes people think that these are things that a guy might talk about, but women really have a lot of very specific bodily desires as well. Having help to get housework done and time to shower so I feel attractive and want to have sex. I'm waiting for somebody to do a study on, a little bit more of this, that, there are certain scents. There's a lot of research on what scents make you feel aroused, like vanilla and this and that. My guess is that having Lysol on your hands is like, for most people, not everyone, for most people, not getting you in the mood for sex. My sexual relationship with my husband is directly in relation to our overall relationship. We love and accept each other, support each other. And from some of the men in our study. Animal instinct. Love, caressing, foreplay. I find sex stressful for fear of loss of erection or fear of orgasm too soon. What makes it enjoyable? Youth. So thank you to all of those who work with people across the lifespan, including older women and men too. It's the entire package. Home life, going out, staying home, simple, nothing complicated. The anticipation of that out-of-the-world feeling. Feeling sexy and loved. She doesn't make me feel less of a man when I am occasionally unable to sustain an erection. It's a celebration of love, affection, and devotion to each other for 29 years. Couldn't be better. I used to believe the climax, but with my wife, definitely the intimacy. We do something to make each other happy every day. That came up a lot, particularly with older respondents who, when we asked them what makes for satisfying sex, or in this case, what makes for enjoyable sex, is we saw a number of both women and men in their 70s, 80s, 90s who talked about just, every day trying to be a little kind and nice to each other. I think these are really the human experiences of sex. It's rich and complex. It's messy. It doesn't always feel great, but we somehow make it through because mostly what we want to do is connect with each other. Thank you very much. Oh, yeah, we've got time for questions. Yeah. Okay, so for pain during intercourse, the question was, how does this look by orientation? And we actually looked at this by partner gender, so not by self-identified orientation, but they are between male, female couples who are having penile vaginal or penile anal intercourse. And so I think, one of the things to consider though in the future, because this question comes up a lot, is to expand the kinds of behaviors we ask about pain in, and not just linking the pain questions off of vaginal or anal. And one of the things we know about, so the second part of the question was, how does lubricant use factor into this? One of the things that we know about lubricant use is that lubricants are, as we all know, commonly used as part of sex, but they're not reducing pain is not the number one reason why people use lubricants. Why do you think people mostly use lubricants? You can just shout it out. Pleasure, fun. But reducing pain is up there. So reducing pain is one of the more common reasons, but fun and pleasure and curiosity are the more common reasons that people use it. So one of the things we've seen, though, is that when people are reporting pain, they are often also reporting using lubricant. Now, if you just looked at that from the outset, you might say, oh, does lubricant use cause pain? No, right? These are data, these are cross-sectional data from a survey, so that likely means that people are then having the pain and then using lubricant in response, or they know that they're prone to pain and then they're using lubricant as well. When we ask people what they did in response to the pain, we ask them things like, did you stop having sex? Did you use lubricant? Did you change positions? Did you do nothing? Did you use cream? Did you take a pill? Did you call a doctor? And so on. And so we do know that using lubricant is one of the most common things that people do and should be doing when they're having pain during sex. Switching sex positions is another common thing that people do. I think it's about half of people do nothing in response to pain. And considering that about 3/4 of men and about 40-odd% of women don't tell their partner when they're in pain, that's a challenge, right? Your partner can't be responsive to you and switch sex positions or reach for the lubricant or briefly stop sex or completely stop sex to be attentive to your pain if you don't share it with them. And so many people, when we ask them, well, why didn't you tell your partner that you were in pain? Some said, well, actually, one woman was kind of funny. She said, well, it would take longer to tell him than sex lasts. So that was a little funny, a little snippy, possibly true, but that's what she said. But most people said they didn't want to ruin the moment. They didn't want to ruin the moment, or they didn't want to, especially the women were so ego protecting and saying, I don't want to hurt his feelings. I don't want to make him feel bad. So there was a lot of that, whereas men weren't typically talking about protecting their partner's feelings, but they were generally talking about not wanting to ruin the moment and so on. So I still think we have a lot to work on with how people manage difficulties that do pop up during sex. There are all kinds of things that happen during sex that can be distracting or painful or difficult, but people don't always know how to talk with each other in or out of the bedroom. Yes?
Debbie, thank you so much. Great talk.
Thank you.
And I loved your results as much as I loved your first quote from Dr. Kinsey. Something a lot of us have been talking about is how to get our research out to a wider audience. I was wondering if you could give us some suggestions from your work about how you do that.
Yeah, thank you. I do think it's so important to get our research out to a wider audience, and there are many different ways that people can do it. Certainly has to be out there in the first place through, research goes in scientific journals, but then what does it do? Does it just live there and no one intersects with it? If you have a blog or if you have a colleague or friend with a blog, you can think about intersecting with them in those ways. I have had a wonderful experience of working with the media. And I think it's so important to work with people who are trained journalists, who know how to get the information out there, who know how to share it in ethical, accurate ways, who will fact check with you to make sure the things that you said and that they're reporting on are correct. And I think that researchers in particular have a lot to learn in that area. I have some colleagues who, when I started working in sex research and working with the media, would say, oh, don't bother, working with the media because they're going to get things wrong or they don't understand. And I felt like some of the people had been burned in bad ways. Some people then learn which media they can trust and which ones they can't. But I also had the experience that, some people who are working with journalists were also, as academics, frankly, not being very nice. They were expecting people who could one day be reporting on sexuality, another day reporting on nutrition, another day reporting on politics, to know everything about their topic. And that's just not the case. I don't know everything about other topics. I know sex. If I was going to talk with somebody about nutrition, they better talk at my level, which is going to be an introductory level to nutrition. So I think that we really need to have a good relationship as partners in that way and share information. I do think scientific journals also need to figure out how to do this. Some of them are starting to make their articles available for free for periods of time. Some journals are exploring open access issues. And I think all of those are important pieces to how do we actually make it available to people. Because if you're not a subscriber to a journal, to be asked to pay $20 or $40 for access to one article is ridiculous. Some of the journals, too, are also starting to look at using, so we're all familiar with the abstract of an article and then the body of the article, but also to look at kind of bullet point take-homes. And I think that that's really helpful, not just to share with the media, but just not all of us have time to read 100 full-text articles. And some of these journals want really, really long articles and so on. And so I think that the more journals that can do that, it puts it in lay language, which can also go across disciplines better, too. So, does someone have a mic? Okay, so you're... Yeah, thanks.
One of my frustrations is that in this culture, we tend to define sex as penile insertion. Mm-hmm. And I love what you do in terms of getting at love and intimacy, but oftentimes that is simply a precursor and a justification for penile insertion. And so I'm wondering how can the researchers kind of tease out that really what we're about here is a sexual experience or an intimate experience rather than that mechanical thing of body part A into body part B. Mm-hmm. And how do you get at that in your research so that particularly you're speaking for the females, especially on that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's a great question, and it's challenging. It's really challenging. So in these studies, what you see is when we ask people, for example, about their most recent sexual experience, and we make it clear that by recent sexual experience, we're talking pretty broadly, like kissing, making out, different kinds of intercourse, breast touching, all kinds of different things, sex toy play, I mean, whatever you kind of consider sex, we want to know about. And then if they, once we get past that question, we have a long list of different types of sexual behaviors they might have engaged in. And then we also ask a lot about the emotional or subjective experiences. So, the intimacy, the love, the pleasure, the desire, all of that. It's a lot of questions to ask. Not all research studies are going to have the time or the space to do that. I would like to see more of them being creative about finding ways to do that. I think we still have some improvements that we could make about what we do in that way, but I think we've done a pretty good job. And that really does broaden the idea about what sex is, because we know it's not just penile vaginal intercourse. For one thing, it can't be, because that always requires a man and a woman with those, well, not always, but it does require people with those parts, and that's not all the interactions that people have. And it turns out, although that's a very dominant behavior with male-female couples, it's of course not a dominant behavior with other ones. So it's challenging. It's challenging, and I think we need not only researchers doing a better job, but also people who are then sharing that information with others, continuing to remind people that this is about more than penises and vaginas and about more than sex. And I think, particularly, with the sex toy industry, for example, we need to see a lot of movement in that area as well. That, sex is about a far wider range of things than just men and women having sex together. And there's been a little bit of research that shows that sometimes the narratives around that within that industry can be really heterosexual. That's not true for all companies. Some are really, really open and broad. I think, Good Vibrations is probably like the original model for how to talk about sex in really diverse ways. And we have some other examples that are really good about that. I know that Jimmy Jane, for example, is doing a lot of education. We actually have somebody from Jimmy Jane who's a former student, so I can vouch for her. I know she's doing a great job of being diverse about the way that she talks about sexuality and inclusive, but it is something that all of us working in this field continue to kind of work on, I think, and could do better with. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Hi, Debbie. Great presentation. Thank you so much. My question is about sexuality education, and it's a two-part question about the questions you've asked the population about. Number one, where are they getting their sexuality education from? And number two, if we're asking where they would like to get it from. So what is their ideal source, and what, if any, is their current source of sexuality education?
Mm-hmm. That's a good question. We actually did ask something somewhat like that a few years ago, and honestly, I don't remember the specific percentages on that. So we do know that a lot of people, certainly younger people, are talking with their parents. People generally stop talking with their parents about sex as they become adults. There are some people who talked about it with a healthcare provider, certainly a number of people getting information from their siblings, from their friends. Those are the overall themes that I remember. And so I think that those are starting places. I think that people who do work on very specific communities have a lot of potential to expand that even more. So, for example, I think of a woman I know who had ovarian cancer several years ago, and she and I had lunch a few months ago, and she was talking about how with about 130 odd medical visits that she had, not a single provider had talked with her about sexuality. In fact, well, that's not true. At one visit when she was going through radiation, they said, well, you might want to keep having sex so that you can kind of keep your vagina open, basically. And she was like, I was going through radiation, I was throwing up, I had diarrhea, like I had all this stuff. Intercourse was the last thing I was thinking about. And this was somebody who had been raised in a very religious conservative home and didn't really know any of the stuff on her own. So she came to me after all this was done, after a friend suggested that we get together and talk. And when I asked her, I said, well, where would you like to receive this information? Like where, some of us have been talking about doing better in this area. What could we do? And she did feel that it should come from a healthcare provider. But when she thought about her healthcare providers, she thought, well, not my radiologist. She was like, he was not warm. There were just a lot of personal characteristics about him that would have been the worst place for her to get that information. But she could think of one nurse she had that I think she felt similar enough to, and that this person was compassionate and open-minded and wouldn't judge her, that was somebody she could get that information from. I think that's one example of a field or an area of life in terms of cancer treatment that we've really completely neglected. Many people have worked in that area. There's some great examples of people doing work in that area, whether it's actually going out into the community and working. I think it's A Woman's Touch, for those of you who knows that store. They've done a lot of wonderful work. But I think in terms of anything widespread and formal, that getting more healthcare providers engaged, that's one example where we really haven't quite figured that out yet. So I think we have, some work we could do in that area, but we also need a lot of people who are kind of deep diving into communities, I think, who can really say, yeah, this is the format, these are the people. Because if we don't have that, we're all just kind of shouting out into the void. And it doesn't really matter if what we say is good if the people who are there aren't wanting it from us, aren't hearing it. Others?
I'm wondering, thank you so much, this is great. I'm wondering if you've looked at all the trends over time and if you're seeing any interesting changes in the past 5 or 6 years since you've been doing that.
We're starting to, so I'm not at a place where I can tell you that, but yeah, that's the beauty of now these annual data collections. We just got 2014 data back not long ago, so I think that this is such a unique opportunity. Although we had that early 1990s nationally representative study and now we have ours, this is the first time that we'll have had longitudinal data in the United States on sexual behavior at the nationally representative level. So that's in the future. I would say that, I guess, okay, not specific people longitudinally, but the overall trends that we are seeing, we're certainly seeing more people use sexual enhancement products. Even though we can't make direct comparisons with the early 90s, we know not many people were using vibrators or dildos back then. I think Ed Lauman's study, there were about 2 or 3% of people who said that in a given year they had purchased. Now, purchase isn't the same as use, but still. Now we have more than half of American women and almost half of American men who have used vibrators. We saw that from 2008 or 8 to 2012, even that went from like 53% of women to almost 56% of women. So we also have, the women's in-home party industry, having toys available in stores like CVS, having toys available through the internet. All these different channels have also allowed more people to find their way of being comfortable. So Terry was talking about, how do we get education to people in ways they're comfortable? Well, how do we get products to people in ways they're comfortable? Not everyone wants to go into a sex toy shop. Not everyone feels comfortable buying on the internet and putting their credit card information in, but having diverse channels has, I think, helped connect more people to the kinds of products that they want, if they want them.
Hi, I'm over here. There's many of us in the field of sexuality education that are wanting to make sure that every conversation that happens around our sexuality specifically addresses racial diversity. And you've talked about some different aspects of diversity, and one of the things I love about what you've presented is that women are very represented, which is not where a lot of the foundation of sexuality research is based previously and historically. And I'm wondering if you can speak to how racial diversity and issues of racism might have been seen or played into any of the research or work you've done? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a good question. So, this is a tricky area. So I think it's not good enough to just slice and dice by like, let's look at this, like race or age group or this and that without having enough context. I think in our next analyses, I was talking with a colleague about this at the Quad S, which was in Omaha recently, is thinking about ways to look at them in more intersectional ways, right? Not just like Black women, white women, Hispanic women, not just women in their 20s, women in their 30s, and so on, but really how a lot of things go together. We don't have, at this point, deep dive questions about people's own experiences of racism specifically. And so I think it's really complicated. I think, especially I was born and raised in Miami, Florida, where racial diversity is not a black-white issue. And so I also sometimes think about these things differently than people, for example, talk about them in Indiana, where I live right now, where diversity is very much like Black, white, Hispanic, only 3 categories. In Miami, like you don't really talk very often about being African American, for example, because Black could be Islander. One of my friends growing up would just say, like, I hate when people say, like, I'm African American because I'm not. Like, I'm from Jamaica and stuff. And she also, had a look that many people thought she was Spanish, and the people would come up and speak Spanish to her, and then she'd be like, I don't know what you're saying and stuff. So, it's really, really challenging. I don't want to do it poorly. None of us want to do it poorly because it's too important of an issue. So I think that's something we need to do better, and we need to bring in the right people to do it better with. Anything else? All right, well, thank you so much for being here this morning.
Thank you.